The great assembly hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of gleaming crystal and metal, its vaulted ceiling reaching toward the artificial stars that provided light for the massive structure. Representatives from 417 species filled the tiered seating, their varied forms creating a tapestry of colors, shapes, and sizes that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Today, however, the atmosphere was thick with tension and barely concealed hostility. Ambassador Zethkar of the Velter Confederacy stood at the central podium, his 6 arms gesturing dramatically as his voice echoed through the chamber's advanced acoustic system. His blue-scaled skin shimmered under the lights as he delivered what many considered the most important speech in galactic history. "Fellow council members," Zethkar began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through centuries of diplomatic service. "We gather today to address the most pressing issue facing our civilized galaxy. The humans have become too powerful, too unpredictable, and frankly, too dangerous to be allowed to continue their expansion unchecked." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The Kredak delegation, their insected features clicking in what passed for applause among their species, showed their support. The crystalline Shardani representatives chimed in harmonious agreement, their bodies ringing like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Zethkar continued, his confidence growing with each supportive gesture from the crowd. "In merely 3 centuries since their introduction to galactic society, humans have established colonies on over 2,000 worlds. They have created the largest merchant fleet in known space, developed military technology that rivals our most advanced civilizations, and worst of all, they have begun to influence other species with their dangerous philosophies." The Vorthan ambassador, a being of pure energy contained within a sophisticated mechanical shell, pulsed with orange light as it spoke. "The humans speak of concepts like individual rights and self-determination. These ideas threaten the very foundations of our carefully maintained social order. Species have begun to question the wisdom of their traditional hierarchies." "Exactly," Zethkar replied, his tone becoming more passionate. "The humans refuse to accept their proper place in the galactic community. They insist on treating all species as equals, regardless of technological advancement, cultural sophistication, or historical significance. This behavior destabilizes the natural order we have spent millennia perfecting." In the human section of the assembly, Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat quietly, her expression carefully neutral despite the growing chorus of accusations. Beside her, the rest of the human delegation maintained their composure, though the tension in their postures was evident to anyone who knew how to read human body language. The quintal representative, resembling a massive tree with glowing bark, spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "The humans have also shown a disturbing tendency toward violence. They maintain one of the largest military forces in the galaxy, despite being one of the youngest civilizations. This aggressive posture threatens galactic peace." Ambassador Vasquez finally stood, requesting permission to speak. The assembly fell silent, hundreds of alien eyes, optical sensors, and sensory organs turning toward her. She was a small figure compared to many of the beings present, but her presence commanded attention nonetheless. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I find these accusations both unfounded and deeply concerning. Humanity has never initiated an aggressive war against any council member. Our military exists solely for defensive purposes and to protect our trade routes from piracy." "Defensive?" The Korthani ambassador's multiple heads spoke in unison, creating an eerie echo. "Your species maintains battle fleets that could level entire worlds. You call that defensive?" Vasquez remained calm. "We maintain sufficient forces to protect our citizens and interests, as is our right under galactic law. Unlike some species present, we have never used our military to subjugate weaker civilizations or force political compliance." The implication in her words was clear, and several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Velter Confederacy had a long history of protecting smaller species through military occupation. The Korthani were known for their tributary systems that were little more than legalized extortion. Zethkar's scales darkened with anger. The humans consistently refuse to participate in the established order of galactic governance. They ignore the authority matrix, they refuse to acknowledge the natural hierarchy of species, and they spread dangerous ideas about equality and freedom wherever they go. "We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all sentient beings. Vasquez replied firmly. If that makes us dangerous, then perhaps this council should examine its own values rather than condemning ours. The chamber erupted in angry voices, translation systems struggling to keep up with the cacophony of alien languages. Some representatives demanded immediate action against humanity, while others called for more measured approaches. A few, primarily from smaller species, remained conspicuously silent. The Ancient Ones, the mysterious energy beings who had founded the Council eons ago, rarely involved themselves in day-to-day politics. But today, their massive forms materialized at the apex of the assembly hall, their presence immediately commanding silence and reverence. When they spoke, their words bypassed the translation systems entirely, appearing directly in the minds of every being present. The concern raised by the Velter representative has merit. The human approach to galactic civilization does indeed threaten the established order. However, direct action against them would be problematic. Zethkar bowed deeply before addressing the Ancient Ones. Revered ancestors, surely the Council has the authority to regulate a species that refuses to conform to galactic standards. Authority and wisdom are not always the same thing, the Ancient Ones replied. However, if the Council wishes to address the human question through legislative means, we will not interfere. With that implicit approval, the momentum in the chamber shifted decisively against humanity. Zethkar seized the moment, proposing a series of resolutions that would effectively cripple human expansion and influence. I propose the Galactic Stability Act, he announced, producing a data crystal containing the proposed legislation. This act would limit human expansion to their current territorial boundaries, require council oversight of all human military activities, mandate cultural compliance protocols for human colonies, and establish economic restrictions to prevent further human dominance in galactic trade. The measures were sweeping in their scope. Humans would be forbidden from establishing new colonies without explicit council approval. Their military would be subject to constant monitoring and size limitations. Human educational systems would be required to teach galactic civic responsibility, which amounted to acceptance of species hierarchy. Most devastating of all, human trade would be subject to tariffs and restrictions that would make it nearly impossible for them to compete in the galactic economy. Ambassador Vasquez listened to each proposal with growing horror, but her expression remained composed. When Zethkar finished his presentation, she requested permission to respond. Honored representatives, she began, these proposals amount to nothing less than the systematic dismantling of human civilization as we know it. You are asking us to abandon our principles, surrender our autonomy, and accept permanent subjugation to this council. We are asking you to become civilized members of galactic society, Zethkar retorted. Every other species has accepted their place in the natural order. Only humans continue to resist the wisdom of ages. Vasquez looked around the chamber, her gaze touching on representatives from species both great and small. And what of those who benefit from the current order? What of the species who profit from the labor of their natural inferiors? What of those who maintain their positions through fear and oppression rather than merit and cooperation? Her words struck home, and she could see the discomfort in many faces. The uncomfortable truth was that the galactic order Zethkar praised so highly was built on a foundation of inequality and exploitation. The humans had disrupted that system simply by refusing to participate in it. You speak of natural hierarchy, Vasquez continued, her voice growing stronger. But I see nothing natural in a system that condemns billions of beings to servitude based on the circumstances of their birth. I see nothing civilized in an order that stifles innovation and progress to maintain the comfort of the privileged few. The chamber fell silent as her words sank in. Many representatives avoided her gaze, unwilling to confront the implications of what she had said. Zethkar recovered quickly, his political instincts guiding his response. The humans seek to destroy the very foundations of galactic civilization. Their words prove that they cannot be trusted to act responsibly. I call for an immediate vote on the Galactic Stability Act. The Ancient Ones pulsed with a faint light, signaling their approval for the proceedings to continue. The vote would happen, regardless of human objections. As the voting procedure began, Ambassador Vasquez made one final attempt to reach the conscience of the Assembly. If you pass these measures, you will force humanity to make an impossible choice. We cannot and will not abandon our fundamental principles. We cannot accept a system that treats sapient beings as property or political tools. If this is the price of membership in your galactic community, then perhaps the cost is too high. Her words carried an undertone of warning that many representatives missed, but a few perceptive beings recognized the implication. The humans were not begging for mercy or attempting to negotiate. They were stating a simple fact: they would not comply. The vote proceeded with mechanical precision. The Velter Confederacy voted in favor, as expected. The Korthani followed suit, eager to see their primary economic competitors crippled. One by one, the major powers added their support to the Galactic Stability Act. Some smaller species abstained, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings but too intimidated to oppose the major powers. A handful of brave representatives voted against the measures, primarily from species that had benefited from human trade and cooperation. When the final tally was announced, the result was decisive: 312 votes in favor, 67 against, and 38 abstentions. The Galactic Stability Act had passed by a significant margin. Ambassador Vasquez stood slowly, her face pale but her bearing dignified. The human delegation formally objects to these proceedings and refuses to recognize the legitimacy of this legislation. We will take your decision under advisement and respond accordingly. With that, she and the entire human delegation walked out of the assembly hall in perfect silence, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet chamber. Behind them, 417 species watched them go, most feeling a sense of satisfaction at having finally put the troublesome humans in their place. None of them realized they had just witnessed the last time humans would ever participate in the Galactic Council. In the days that followed the vote, the Council's enforcement mechanisms swung into action with practiced efficiency. Monitoring stations were established along human borders to ensure compliance with the new territorial restrictions. Trade inspection points were set up at major galactic crossroads to implement the economic sanctions. Cultural compliance officers were assigned to human worlds to oversee the mandatory educational reforms. There was just one problem: the humans were gone. Not just their ships or their government representatives, but everyone. Every human colony, every space station, every trading post, every diplomatic mission had been evacuated with the same eerie silence that had marked their departure from the Council Assembly. It began to dawn on the galactic community that the humans had taken Ambassador Vasquez's words quite literally. If the price of galactic citizenship was too high, they simply wouldn't pay it. They had packed up their entire civilization and left, heading into the vast, unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim. They had departed in silence, leaving behind only empty worlds and a mystery that would haunt the galaxy for generations to come. The first signs that something was fundamentally wrong came from the Rigel Commercial Hub, one of the largest trading centers in the galaxy. Station Commander Yixtel of the Hegemony Trade Commission had been looking forward to implementing the new human trade restrictions. As a species that had long resented human commercial success, the Hegemony saw the Galactic Stability Act as an opportunity to reclaim their lost market share. But when Yixtel's enforcement teams arrived at the human trading quarter, they found nothing but empty corridors and powered-down facilities. Not a single human remained on the station that had once hosted the largest human commercial operation outside of their home territories. "This is impossible," Yixtel muttered to his assistant, a nervous Velter bureaucrat named Kethlin. "There were over 50,000 humans working in this sector just last week. The preliminary scans showed massive economic activity. Where could they have gone?" Kethlin consulted his data pad, his claws clicking nervously against its surface. "Sir, our records show that all human contracts were terminated 3 days ago. They submitted formal notices of withdrawal from all commercial agreements and departed with their assets." "All of them?" Yixtel's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of extreme confusion among his species. "They can't have moved 50,000 people and their equipment in 3 days. It would require hundreds of ships." "Actually, sir," Kethlin's voice grew even more uncertain, "the departure manifests show they used over 800 vessels of various sizes. The logistics are impressive." As reports flooded in from across the galaxy, the scope of the human evacuation became clear. It wasn't just the Rigel hub. Every human settlement, every trading post, every diplomatic mission, every research station had been evacuated with the same quiet efficiency. On the former human colony of New Geneva, survey team leader Throcktor of the Credak Hive examined the abandoned settlement with growing bewilderment. The colony had housed nearly 2 million humans and represented one of their most successful terraforming projects. Now it stood empty, its buildings intact but devoid of life. "The infrastructure is completely undamaged," reported to his superiors through his hive mind link. "The humans didn't destroy anything, they simply left. The hydroponics facilities are still running on automatic. The fusion reactors are in standby mode. Even the streetlights are still functioning." What disturbed Throcktor most was the thoroughness of the evacuation. The humans had taken everything of value, but left behind a functioning colony that could theoretically house millions of beings. It was as if they had wanted to demonstrate that they could abandon years of work without a second thought. Similar reports came in from across human space. On the mining world of Kepler's dream, the humans had left behind fully operational mining equipment worth billions of credits. On the agricultural world of Harmony Fields, they had abandoned crops ready for harvest and processing facilities that represented decades of development. The economic implications began to sink in as the first week passed. The Galactic Stock Exchange experienced its worst day in recorded history as the reality of human withdrawal became apparent. Human corporations had been major players in nearly every sector of the galactic economy. Their sudden absence created massive gaps in supply chains, trade routes, and financial networks. Ambassador Zethkar found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain to his own government why their major trading partners had vanished overnight. The Velter Confederacy had been among the species most eager to restrict human economic activity, but they had never imagined the humans would simply remove themselves entirely from the galactic economy. "The preliminary economic assessment is concerning," Zethkar's aide informed him during their daily briefing. Human businesses were involved in the transportation of approximately 37% of all interstellar cargo. Their shipping companies handled logistics for thousands of species. Without them, trade routes that have operated for centuries are now non-functional. Zethkar's scales shifted to a darker shade of blue, indicating stress among his people. Surely other species can take over these operations. The galaxy existed before the humans arrived. "Yes, sir, but the scale of replacement required is enormous. The humans had been expanding these networks for 3 centuries. It would take decades for other species to build equivalent capacity, assuming they can coordinate effectively." The coordination problem was already becoming apparent. The human approach to business had been notably different from most galactic species. Where others operated within rigid hierarchies and traditional boundaries, humans had created vast networks of cooperation that crossed species lines. They had somehow convinced natural competitors to work together in mutually beneficial arrangements. Without human mediators and organizers, these networks began to collapse almost immediately. Species that had cooperated under human guidance reverted to their traditional rivalries and mistrust. Trade agreements that had seemed stable for decades suddenly became sources of conflict, as different interpretations emerged without human negotiators to find common ground. The crisis deepened when the Frontier Security Network began reporting massive gaps in their coverage. The humans had maintained patrol and rescue operations across vast stretches of space, particularly in the dangerous frontier regions where piracy was common. Their departure left these areas completely unprotected. Captain Vordash of the Hegemony Security Force received the emergency briefing with growing alarm. "You're telling me that human patrol ships were responsible for security across 8,000 cubic light-years of frontier space?" His intelligence officer, a crystalline being whose species communicated through harmonic resonance, sang a low note of confirmation. "The humans maintained 47 patrol bases and operated constant patrols throughout the region. They responded to distress calls from any species, provided escort services for valuable cargo, and maintained communication networks across the entire frontier. And now the frontier is completely undefended. Pirate activity has increased by 400% in just the past week. Several colonies have reported attacks, and at least 12 merchant vessels have been reported missing." The security vacuum created by human withdrawal was felt most acutely by smaller species that had relied on human protection. These civilizations lacked the resources to maintain their own security forces and had depended on human patrols to keep their trade routes safe. The gentle folk of Andromeda's edge, a peaceful species that had never developed military technology, sent desperate pleas to the Council for protection. Their representative, a being that resembled a walking flower, spoke with barely controlled panic. The humans promised us safety in exchange for our agricultural products. They maintained a base in our system and responded to threats within hours. Now pirates have already attacked 3 of our cargo ships. We have no defenses, no weapons, no way to protect ourselves. The Council must help us. But the Council was discovering that replacing human capabilities was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The humans hadn't just provided services. They had created entire systems of cooperation and mutual support that had become integral to galactic civilization. Dr. Senthara, the Council's chief economic advisor, presented her preliminary analysis to an emergency session of the Leadership Committee. Her tentacles writhed with agitation as she spoke, a clear sign of distress among her aquatic species. The human economic withdrawal has created cascading failures throughout the galactic economy, she reported. Their departure has disrupted not just their direct business relationships, but the entire network of secondary and tertiary connections they facilitated. Committee Chairman Velthar leaned forward in his hover chair. Explain. The humans excelled at creating what they called win-win scenarios. They would identify opportunities where multiple species could benefit from cooperation, then organize and manage these relationships. For example, the Shardani produced advanced computer crystals, but they needed rare minerals that the Korthani controlled. The Korthani needed those crystals, but also required organic compounds that only the gentle folk could produce efficiently. The humans created a 3-way trading relationship that benefited everyone. So find new mediators, Velthar suggested impatiently. Dr. Senthara's tentacles curled tighter. It's not that simple. The humans were managing thousands of such relationships simultaneously. They had created an interconnected web of cooperation that spanned the entire galaxy. Without their coordination, these relationships are collapsing back into the traditional pattern of bilateral negotiations and competing interests. The social implications were becoming equally apparent. The Philosophical Institute of Higher Learning, based on the ancient world of contemplation, released a study that sent shockwaves through academic circles across the galaxy. Professor Mechthal, a renowned expert in interspecies sociology, summarized the findings in terms that even politicians could understand. Human society was fundamentally different from any other known civilization. While most species developed hierarchical structures based on inherited traits, biological capabilities, or historical dominance, humans created systems based on individual merit and voluntary cooperation. That was precisely the problem, interjected Counselor Yethrin. Their refusal to accept natural hierarchy was destabilizing traditional order. Professor Mechthal's sensory stalks swayed in disagreement. What we're now discovering is that human systems were remarkably effective. Their approach to social organization produced higher levels of innovation, greater economic efficiency, and notably lower levels of internal conflict. They had essentially solved many of the problems that have plagued galactic civilization for millennia. The professor's research revealed something that made many council members deeply uncomfortable. Human society hadn't just been different. By many measurable standards, it had been better. Their crime rates were lower, their productivity was higher, their scientific advancement was faster, and their citizens reported greater satisfaction with their lives. More disturbing was the discovery that other species had begun adopting human social models. Dozens of worlds had experimented with human-style democratic governance, merit-based advancement, and individual rights. The preliminary results from these experiments were overwhelmingly positive. The humans weren't just trading partners, Professor Mechthal concluded. They were inadvertently demonstrating that our traditional ways of organizing society might not be the best possible approaches. Their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy, governance, and interspecies relations. As the second week of human absence passed, the full scope of the crisis began to emerge. The Galactic Communication Network, largely maintained by human technical specialists, began experiencing failures as automated systems broke down without proper maintenance. The Interstellar Navigation Network, which had relied heavily on human-operated beacon stations, started showing dangerous gaps in coverage. Most critically, the galaxy's research and development infrastructure revealed its dependence on human innovation. Humans had been disproportionately represented in scientific research, not because they were necessarily more intelligent than other species, but because their society encouraged the kind of creative thinking and risk-taking that drove breakthrough discoveries. Dr. Zixnell of the Advanced Research Consortium delivered the devastating news to the Council's Science Committee. Human researchers were involved in approximately 60% of all major scientific projects currently underway. They weren't just participants. They were often the driving force behind innovative approaches and breakthrough thinking. Surely other species can continue their work, Committee Chair Lochter suggested, though his confidence was clearly shaken. That's the problem, Dr. Zixnell replied. The humans approached research differently. While most species followed established methodologies and built incrementally on existing knowledge, humans excelled at asking questions that no one else had thought to ask. They challenged assumptions that other species considered fundamental. The examples were numerous and troubling. A joint project to develop new forms of sustainable energy had ground to a halt because the human team members had been the ones pushing for unconventional approaches that other species had considered too risky or impractical. A breakthrough medical research program collapsed when it became clear that the human researchers had been the primary source of innovative treatment concepts. Perhaps most significantly, the galaxy's defense research program revealed its critical dependence on human strategic thinking. Humans had been instrumental in developing new defensive technologies and tactical approaches that had kept the galaxy safe from various external threats. General Korthak of the Unified Defense Command found himself in the uncomfortable position of briefing the Council on their military vulnerability. Human strategic advisors had identified several potential threats that our traditional military thinking had overlooked. They were developing countermeasures for scenarios that we hadn't even considered possible. What kind of scenarios? Demanded Defense Counselor Vrextel. General Korthak's mandibles clicked nervously. The humans had been particularly concerned about the possibility of coordinated attacks by nomadic raider fleets from beyond the galactic rim. Our traditional defenses are designed to counter threats from known hostile species within our territory. The humans had been working on mobile defense platforms and rapid response capabilities designed to counter unknown threats from unexpected directions. The implications were chilling. The galaxy's defensive planning had become dependent on human innovation and strategic thinking. Without them, the Unified Defense Command was left with conventional approaches that might prove inadequate against unconventional threats. As reports continued to pour in from across known space, a disturbing pattern emerged. Everywhere humans had been involved, their absence was creating significant problems. They had somehow become integral to the functioning of galactic civilization in ways that no one had fully recognized. The Council that had been so eager to restrict human influence was beginning to realize that they might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. The humans hadn't just been another member species to be managed and controlled. They had become an essential component of galactic civilization itself. And now they were gone, departed into the unknown regions beyond the galactic rim, leaving behind a civilization that was discovering just how much it had depended on the very people it had tried to suppress. 3 months after the human departure, Ambassador Zethkar stood in what had once been the bustling human quarter of the Council's central diplomatic station. The corridors that had formerly echoed with the sounds of human voices and activity now stood silent and empty, their lights dimmed to conserve power. The air recycling systems still hummed, but they were processing an atmosphere meant for ghosts. Zethkar's aide, Kethlin, approached with a data pad containing the latest reports. His usually precise demeanor had deteriorated over the past weeks as the scope of the crisis became apparent. "Sir, the latest economic projections have been updated. There." Not encouraging. "How bad?" Zethkar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Galactic trade volume has decreased by 42%. The outer rim territories are experiencing near-total economic collapse. 17 species have formally requested emergency aid, and at least 30 more are expected to follow suit within the next month. Zethkar's scales darkened further. The Galactic Stability Act was supposed to have strengthened the galaxy's economy by removing what they had seen as unfair human competition. Instead, it had triggered the worst economic crisis in recorded galactic history. What about the replacement programs? Surely other species are moving to fill the gaps left by human withdrawal. Kethlin's claws clicked nervously against his data pad. That's part of the problem, sir. The species that are capable of replacing human services are demanding extremely high compensation. The Hegemony Trade Commission has increased their shipping rates by 300%. The Velter Confederacy is charging premium prices for security services. Many smaller species simply can't afford the replacement costs. The economic predators of the galaxy had indeed moved quickly to exploit the vacuum left by human departure. But their approaches were fundamentally different from human business practices. Where humans had sought to create mutual benefit and long-term relationships, the traditional galactic powers were extracting maximum short-term profit from desperate clients. On the agricultural world of Harmony Fields, the situation had become desperate. Colony Administrator Vexhai of the Farming Collective faced impossible choices as she struggled to maintain the colony's operations without human support. "The harvest is rotting in the fields," she reported during the emergency session with her species' home government. The humans maintained the entire distribution network. They had contracts with dozens of species across 16 star systems. Without their shipping and logistics, we can't get our products to market. The response from her superiors was predictably unhelpful. Find alternative buyers, negotiate new shipping contracts. "We've tried," Vexhai replied with growing frustration. "The Hegemony Trade Commission wants to charge us 4 times what the humans charged, and they're demanding exclusive rights to all our exports for the next century. The Korthani are offering better rates, but they want us to switch to crops that only they can use, which would mean abandoning our traditional agricultural knowledge." The situation on Harmony Fields was being repeated across hundreds of worlds. The humans had created economic relationships that were beneficial to all parties involved. Their replacements were offering relationships that primarily benefited the providers of services, often at the expense of their clients' long-term viability. Dr. Yilnara of the Economic Research Institute had been studying the human approach to commerce and was beginning to understand why their system had been so successful. Her latest report to the Council contained insights that challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic economics. Human businesses operated on what they called sustainable growth models, she explained to the Economic Affairs Committee. Rather than extracting maximum short-term profit, they focused on creating long-term relationships that would generate stable returns over extended periods. Committee Chairman Thexmer, a traditionalist from one of the oldest species in the galaxy, shook his massive head. "That sounds like they were leaving money on the table. Any competent business should maximize profit extraction." Dr. Yilnara's research suggested otherwise. Actually, their approach generated higher total returns over time. By ensuring their partners remained prosperous, humans created stable, growing markets for their own products and services. A typical human-business relationship lasted decades and generated increasing value throughout its duration. "Whereas our traditional approaches?" Thexmer asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Our traditional approaches focus on immediate advantage and maximum extraction. The average interspecies business relationship in galactic history has lasted approximately 7 years before one party finds a more advantageous alternative, or the relationship becomes unsustainable due to exploitation." The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just been successful despite their unusual business practices. They had been successful because of them. They had somehow figured out how to create economic systems that grew stronger over time rather than consuming themselves through internal competition and exploitation. Meanwhile, the security situation continued to deteriorate across the galaxy's frontier regions. Captain Vordash of the Hegemony Security Force found himself overwhelmed by requests for protection that his forces simply couldn't meet. "The pirates are getting bolder," he reported to his superiors during a particularly frustrating briefing. "They've realized that there's no coordinated response to their activities. What used to be isolated raids have become organized campaigns." The human security network had been built on principles of rapid response and overwhelming force applied precisely where needed. They had maintained detailed intelligence networks that allowed them to anticipate pirate activities and position their forces accordingly. Most importantly, they had coordinated their efforts across species boundaries, creating a unified response to threats. The replacement security forces operated very differently. Each species protected its own interests first and foremost. Coordination between different security forces was minimal and often hindered by traditional rivalries and competing priorities. The Bleeding Star pirates have taken control of the entire Nexus shipping lane, Captain Vordash continued. They're demanding tribute from any ship that wants to pass through. 3 species have already agreed to pay rather than risk their cargo vessels. His commander, Admiral Yexkel, studied the tactical displays with growing concern. What would the humans have done in this situation? Based on their previous responses, they would have deployed a task force of approximately 30 ships to the region. They would have coordinated with local security forces from at least 4 different species. They would have established patrol patterns that made it impossible for the pirates to predict safe hiding spots, and they would have maintained that presence until the threat was completely eliminated. And our current response? Captain Vordash's expression darkened. We've assigned 12 ships to patrol the general area when they're not needed elsewhere. We have no coordination with other species forces. We have no intelligence network to track pirate movements. And our standing orders are to prioritize the protection of hegemony vessels over general security. The result was predictable. Pirate activity had increased dramatically across the galaxy's frontier regions. Several smaller species had been forced to abandon entire star systems because they couldn't maintain safe shipping routes. The galactic economy's expansion into new territories had ground to a halt. But the most troubling developments were occurring in the realm of interspecies relations. The Philosophical Institute's follow-up study revealed that human withdrawal was triggering a reversion to historical patterns of conflict and competition that many had thought were permanently resolved. Professor Mechthal presented his findings to an increasingly concerned council leadership. Human diplomatic methods were fundamentally different from traditional galactic approaches. They consistently sought what they called win-win solutions where all parties benefited from agreements. That sounds naive, commented Counselor Velthar. Diplomacy is about advancing your own interests, not giving gifts to your rivals. That was our assumption as well, Professor Mechthal replied. But human diplomatic techniques were remarkably effective. In 3 centuries, they successfully mediated over 2,000 interspecies disputes. Their success rate was approximately 93%, compared to a historical average of 37% for traditional galactic diplomacy. The professor's research revealed that human diplomats had approached conflicts with a fundamentally different mindset. Instead of viewing negotiations as zero-sum games where one party's gain required another's loss, they sought creative solutions that addressed the underlying needs of all involved parties. For example, the territorial dispute of 2387 between the Kretak and the Shardani, Professor Mechthal continued. Traditional diplomacy had failed to resolve this conflict for over a century. Human mediators solved it in 6 months by identifying that both species needed resources that were abundant in the disputed territory, but they were different resources. The humans proposed a joint mining operation that gave both species access to what they needed while sharing the costs of extraction. Without human mediators, old conflicts were beginning to resurface. Species that had cooperated for decades under human guidance were reverting to historical mistrust and competition. Territorial disputes that had been considered permanently resolved were suddenly becoming active sources of tension again. The situation on the disputed worlds was particularly concerning. These 12 star systems had been claimed by 3 different species for over 4 centuries. Human diplomats had negotiated a complex sharing agreement that gave each species access to the resources they needed while preventing direct conflict. Now, without human oversight, the old rivalries were reasserting themselves. The Korthani had begun moving military assets into the region, claiming that the sharing agreement was no longer valid without human enforcement. The Velter were responding by deploying their own forces, ostensibly for defensive purposes. The third party, a smaller species called the Tree Singers, were calling desperately for council intervention before full-scale warfare erupted. Emergency mediator Thalkin had been assigned to address the crisis, but he was discovering just how difficult it was to replicate human diplomatic success. The three species refused to meet in the same room, he reported to the Council's Crisis Management Committee. Each insists that they have the strongest historical claim to the territory. None are willing to consider sharing arrangements that don't give them clear advantage over their rivals. What did the human mediators do differently? Asked Committee Chair Lixara. Thalkin consulted his notes with obvious frustration. According to the records, they spent months studying each species' actual needs rather than their stated demands. They discovered that the Korthani primarily needed access to rare metals for their manufacturing. The Velter wanted the agricultural potential of three specific worlds, and the tree singers required the unique acoustic properties of certain crystal formations for their cultural practices. So they gave each species what they actually needed. It was more complex than that. The humans designed a system where each species' activities actually supported the others. Korthani mining operations provided processed soil that enhanced Velter agriculture. Velter farming created organic compounds that the tree singers needed for their crystal cultivation. The tree singers' acoustic resonance techniques helped locate new mineral deposits for Korthani extraction. The genius of the human approach was becoming apparent to those who studied it carefully. They had somehow managed to transform competitive relationships into cooperative ones by identifying hidden complementarities and mutual benefits. Without human guidance, such sophisticated diplomatic solutions seemed impossible to achieve. Traditional galactic diplomacy was reverting to its historical patterns of temporary truces, competing claims, and eventual conflicts. As the fourth month of human absence began, the Council found itself facing a cascade of crises that their traditional approaches seemed unable to address effectively. The economic collapse was accelerating. Security problems were spreading beyond the frontier regions. Diplomatic conflicts were multiplying as old agreements broke down without human mediation. Perhaps most troubling of all was the growing recognition that the humans had somehow become essential to the functioning of galactic civilization without anyone fully realizing it. They hadn't conquered through force or dominated through superior technology. They had simply created systems and relationships that worked better than traditional alternatives. Now, faced with the collapse of those systems, the galaxy was beginning to understand the true extent of what they had lost when they forced the humans to choose between their principles and their membership in galactic society. The humans had chosen their principles and departed in silence, leaving behind a civilization that was discovering just how much it had depended on the very people it had tried to control. 6 months after the human departure, the emergency session of the Galactic Council convened under circumstances that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The Great Assembly Hall, once a symbol of galactic unity and cooperation, now felt like a hospital waiting room where family members gathered to discuss the failing health of a dying patient. Ambassador Zethkar, who had once stood proudly at the central podium advocating for the Galactic Stability Act, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to his fellow council members why their decisive action had led to galactic instability on an unprecedented scale. The situation reports from across known space paint a troubling picture, he began, his voice lacking the confidence that had once made him such an effective political leader. Economic indicators have reached critical levels in 47% of council member systems. Security incidents have increased by 800% in frontier regions. Diplomatic relations between member species have deteriorated to levels not seen since the pre-council era. The silence that followed his summary was heavy with unspoken accusations and growing desperation. Representatives who had once eagerly supported restrictions on human influence now found themselves dealing with the catastrophic consequences of getting exactly what they had asked for. Dr. Senthara, the Council's chief economic advisor, approached the podium with a data crystal containing her comprehensive analysis of the galactic economic situation. Her tentacles, normally a vibrant blue color, had faded to a pale gray that indicated severe stress among her aquatic species. "Honored representatives," she began, "I must report that our economic situation has moved beyond crisis into what can only be described as systemic collapse. The removal of human economic activity has created cascading failures throughout the galactic financial system." She activated the holographic displays that filled the chamber with disturbing statistical projections. Trade volume has decreased by 62%. Unemployment among council member species has reached an average of 37%. Most critically, the innovation index has dropped to levels not seen since the pre-technological era for most civilizations. The innovation crisis was perhaps the most frightening aspect of the human withdrawal. The galaxy had become accustomed to steady technological and social progress, much of which had been driven by human creativity and willingness to challenge conventional approaches. Without that driving force, galactic civilization was not just stagnating, it was beginning to regress. Professor Mechthal had spent months analyzing the human contribution to galactic innovation, and his findings were sobering. Human researchers and inventors were responsible for approximately 78% of breakthrough discoveries in the past century, he reported. But more importantly, they served as catalysts that inspired innovation in other species. Their willingness to question fundamental assumptions encouraged others to think beyond traditional limitations. The examples were numerous and devastating. Medical research programs that had been on the verge of curing ancient diseases had ground to a halt without human researchers pushing for unconventional treatment approaches. Energy research projects that had promised to solve the galaxy's growing power needs had been abandoned because other species couldn't replicate the creative thinking that humans had brought to the problems. Even more troubling was the discovery that many non-human innovations had actually been inspired by human ideas or built upon human-designed foundations. What had appeared to be independent scientific progress by other species was revealed to have been heavily influenced by human collaborative approaches. We're facing what the humans might have called a brain drain, Professor Mechthal concluded. But instead of losing talented individuals to other organizations, we've lost an entire species that had become integral to our intellectual development. The security situation had become equally dire. General Korthak of the Unified Defense Command presented an assessment that left many representatives questioning whether their traditional military approaches were adequate for the challenges they now faced. The frontier regions are essentially lawless, he reported with obvious frustration. Pirate confederations have established permanent bases in areas that the humans previously kept secure. Several of these groups have grown so powerful that they're demanding tribute from entire star systems. But the pirates were the least of their problems. Intelligence reports had begun to filter in about unusual activities beyond the galactic rim, in the same direction that the humans had departed. Long-range sensors were detecting massive energy signatures and what appeared to be large-scale construction projects in previously unexplored space. We're also receiving disturbing reports from our deep space monitoring stations, General Korthak continued. There are indications of significant technological activity approximately 200 light-years beyond our furthest outposts. The energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases, but the scale suggests industrial operations of enormous scope. The implication was clear, though none of the representatives wanted to speak it aloud. The humans hadn't just disappeared. They had been busy building something in the unexplored regions beyond galactic civilization. The question that haunted many minds was whether they were building defenses against their former associates or preparing for something else entirely. Councillor Velthar raised the concern that many others were thinking but afraid to voice. Is it possible that the humans view us as a threat? Their departure was remarkably well organized and comprehensive. This wasn't the action of a species fleeing in panic. They planned this evacuation carefully. The possibility that the humans might return as enemies rather than friends was becoming a source of growing anxiety throughout the Council. Human military technology had been among the most advanced in the galaxy, and their strategic thinking had often surpassed that of species with millions of years more experience in warfare. Dr. Yilnara of the Economic Research Institute had been studying human industrial capacity, and her findings were deeply unsettling. Human manufacturing capabilities were significantly more advanced than we realized, she reported. Their industrial efficiency was approximately 4 times higher than galactic averages. They were producing far more than they consumed, which suggests they had been stockpiling resources and equipment for some time before their departure. Stockpiling for what purpose? Demanded Councillor Thexmer. That's the disturbing question, Dr. Yilnara replied. Given their industrial capacity and the timeline of their evacuation, they could have been preparing for this departure for decades. The speed and efficiency of their withdrawal suggests they had contingency plans that we never suspected. The possibility that the humans had been planning their departure long before the Galactic Stability Act raised uncomfortable questions about human intelligence gathering and long-term strategic thinking. Had they somehow anticipated that the galaxy would eventually turn against them? Had they been preparing for this eventuality while maintaining friendly relations with species that were simultaneously plotting to restrict their freedoms? Meanwhile, the social consequences of human departure were becoming apparent in ways that touched the daily lives of beings across the galaxy. The Human Rights Observer Corps reported that species which had been experimenting with human-inspired social reforms were experiencing internal conflicts as traditional power structures reasserted themselves. On the world of New Harmony, the democratic experiment that had been inspired by human governance models was collapsing under pressure from traditional aristocratic families. Representative Yilkin of the Harmony Democracy sent desperate pleas to the council for support as her government faced violent opposition from nobles who wanted to restore the historical caste system. The humans helped us understand that our traditional hierarchy wasn't natural or inevitable, she reported during an emergency session. They showed us that individuals could be judged by their actions and abilities rather than their birth circumstances. But without their guidance and support, the old ways are returning with a vengeance. Similar conflicts were erupting across dozens of worlds where human influence had inspired social experimentation. The departure of human advisors, educators, and social workers had left these experimental societies vulnerable to counter-revolutions by traditional power structures. The philosophical implications were perhaps even more disturbing than the practical consequences. The contemplative order, which had spent centuries studying different approaches to civilization and social organization, released a report that questioned fundamental assumptions about galactic society. Grand philosopher Zexthal presented their conclusions to the Council's Cultural Affairs Committee with obvious reluctance. Our analysis suggests that human society represented a fundamentally different approach to civilization that may have been superior to our traditional models in most measurable ways. The statement sent shockwaves through the committee. The idea that a relatively young species might have developed better approaches to social organization than civilizations with millions of years of experience was almost unthinkable to many representatives. Human society emphasized individual potential, voluntary cooperation, and merit-based advancement, Grand philosopher Zexthal continued. These principles produced higher levels of innovation, greater economic efficiency, lower crime rates, and notably higher citizen satisfaction than traditional hierarchical systems. But surely their system had flaws, protested Committee Chair Lockmaven. No social system is perfect. Certainly human society had problems, the Grand philosopher agreed. But their approach to addressing these problems was notably different from our traditional methods. Rather than accepting problems as inevitable consequences of natural hierarchy, humans actively worked to solve them through innovation and social adaptation. The report's most disturbing conclusion was that human society had been evolving and improving at a rate that far exceeded anything seen in traditional galactic civilizations. While most species had developed stable social systems that changed very little over millennia, humans had been constantly experimenting with new approaches to governance, economics, and social organization. Human civilization was not static, Grand philosopher Zexthal explained. They treated their social systems as ongoing experiments that could be modified and improved based on results. This adaptive approach allowed them to solve problems that we have considered unsolvable for millions of years. As the months passed, the weight of their decision pressed down on the Council with increasing force. They had acted to preserve galactic stability by restricting a species they viewed as dangerously disruptive to traditional order. Instead, they had triggered the greatest crisis in galactic history and lost access to innovations and capabilities they were discovering they couldn't replicate. The humans had been different, challenging, and often frustrating to traditional galactic powers. But they had also been beneficial partners, effective mediators, innovative problem solvers, and reliable defenders of civilized values. Their approach to civilization had offered solutions to problems that had plagued the galaxy for eons. Now they were gone, departed in silence to build something new beyond the rim of known space. The galaxy they had left behind was discovering that their absence created voids that traditional approaches couldn't fill. Ambassador Zethkar stood once again at the central podium, but this time his message was very different from his confident advocacy of 6 months earlier. "Fellow representatives," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "we must face the possibility that we have made a terrible mistake. The humans offered us partnership, cooperation, and innovation. In response, we demanded their submission to systems that they found morally unacceptable. We thought we were preserving galactic stability. Instead, we may have driven away the very people who could have helped us build a better future for all our species." The chamber fell silent as the implications of his words settled over the assembly. For the first time since the human departure, many representatives were beginning to wonder if they had lost something precious that could never be recovered. 1 year after the human departure, the Galactic Council faced its darkest hour. The emergency session that convened in the Great Assembly Hall was unlike any in the institution's history. Representatives arrived not with the confidence of beings governing a thriving interstellar civilization, but with the desperate urgency of survivors trying to salvage what remained of a collapsing society. Ambassador Zethkar, once the most vocal advocate for restricting human influence, now bore the weight of responsibility for a decision that had brought the galaxy to its knees. His scales had lost their vibrant blue coloration, fading to a dull gray that reflected the burden he carried. As he stood at the central podium, many representatives noticed that he seemed to have aged decades in the past year. "Fellow members of the Council," he began, his voice carrying none of its former authority, "we convene today to address a crisis that threatens the very existence of our civilization. The statistics you have received paint a picture of systematic collapse across all aspects of galactic society." The numbers were indeed devastating. Galactic trade had decreased by 78%. Over 200 star systems had requested emergency aid. 47 species had experienced government collapses as economic hardship led to social unrest. Most troubling of all, several member species had begun exploring the possibility of leaving Council space entirely, following the human example of seeking their fortunes beyond the galactic rim. Dr. Senthara approached the podium to deliver what many considered the most important economic analysis in galactic history. Her aquatic species had evolved to display emotional states through subtle color changes, and the deep purple that now dominated her tentacles indicated a level of distress that bordered on despair. "The galactic economy has entered what economists call a death spiral," she reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "The removal of human economic activity didn't just reduce trade volume, it destroyed the fundamental networks that made galactic commerce possible." Her holographic displays filled the chamber with charts and graphs that told a story of civilizational decline. Human businesses had created what they called network effects. Each new participant in their economic system made the entire network more valuable for all participants. When they left, these network effects collapsed, creating negative feedback loops that have accelerated economic decline beyond our worst projections. The audience listened in stunned silence as Dr. Senthara explained how human economic principles had unknowingly become the foundation upon which galactic prosperity had been built. Their approach to creating mutual benefit, their willingness to invest in long-term relationships, and their innovative solutions to complex problems had generated wealth and stability that traditional economic models couldn't replicate. "We estimate that it would take approximately 2 centuries to rebuild the economic networks that humans created over 300 years, she concluded. "That assumes perfect cooperation between all council members and no additional crises during the reconstruction period." The 2-century timeline for economic recovery was based on optimistic assumptions that many representatives privately considered unrealistic. Perfect cooperation between council members had been rare even during prosperous times. With resources scarce and tensions rising, such cooperation seemed impossible. General Korthak delivered an equally sobering assessment of the galactic security situation. "The frontier regions are no longer merely lawless," he reported. "They have become actively hostile to Council authority. Several pirate confederations have grown large enough to challenge our naval forces directly." But the pirates were no longer the primary security concern. We've confirmed that the energy signatures detected beyond the galactic rim represent massive construction projects, General Korthak continued. Long-range reconnaissance has identified what appear to be industrial complexes, defensive installations, and what can only be described as cities built in space. The images from the reconnaissance missions were both impressive and terrifying. The humans had indeed been busy during their year of exile, constructing orbital habitats and industrial facilities on a scale that dwarfed anything in known galactic space. The technological sophistication evident in these constructions suggested that human civilization had not just survived their departure, it had thrived. Most concerning, General Korthak added, is that our reconnaissance drones have been consistently detected and disabled by automated defense systems. Human technology appears to have advanced significantly beyond what we knew them to possess when they departed. The possibility that the humans were developing superior technology in isolation was a source of growing anxiety throughout the Council. During their time as members of galactic society, humans had been innovative but not dramatically more advanced than other species. Their year in exile appeared to have unleashed a level of technological development that was both impressive and potentially threatening. Councillor Velthar voiced the concern that many representatives shared but few dared to express. Are we looking at the emergence of a potential enemy? The humans left peacefully, but they may view our actions as a declaration of hostility. The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The Council had forced the humans to choose between their principles and their membership in galactic society. The humans had chosen their principles and departed. But what were their intentions now? Were they building a new civilization in isolation, or were they preparing for something more ominous? Professor Mechthal of the Philosophical Institute had spent the past year studying human culture and psychology in an attempt to understand their likely motivations. His analysis provided some insight into human thinking, but it also raised disturbing questions about galactic society's treatment of the species they had driven away. Human psychology differs significantly from most Council species, he reported. They place extraordinary value on concepts like justice, autonomy, and moral consistency. When forced to compromise these values, they experience what they call cognitive dissonance that can lead to dramatic behavioral changes. Professor Mechthal's research suggested that the humans had not departed in anger or spite, but rather in profound disappointment. They had genuinely believed in the possibility of creating a galactic civilization based on cooperation and mutual respect. The Council's decision to impose hierarchical control over them had shattered that belief. The humans didn't view the Galactic Stability Act as a political setback, Professor Mechthal explained. They saw it as a moral betrayal by people they had considered friends and partners. Their departure wasn't revenge. It was a statement that they would rather rebuild civilization from scratch than participate in a system they found morally unacceptable. This analysis provided some comfort to representatives who feared human retaliation, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the morality of their own actions. Had the Council really been so wrong about the proper way to organize galactic society? Had they driven away a species that could have helped them build something better? As if summoned by these troubling thoughts, a new development emerged that would force the Council to confront the full consequences of their decision. Emergency communications began flooding into the assembly hall from across known space. The messages all carried the same shocking news. Humanity had returned. But they had not returned as refugees seeking readmission to galactic society. Instead, human ships had begun appearing in systems throughout Council space, offering aid to worlds suffering from the economic and social collapse that had followed human departure. The first reports came from the agricultural world of Harmony Fields, where the colony had been struggling to maintain basic operations since the collapse of their human-mediated trade networks. Colony Administrator Vexhai transmitted her incredulous report directly to the Council emergency session. 3 human ships arrived in our system this morning, she announced, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. They're offering to restore our trade networks, provide technical assistance for our agricultural operations, and help us establish new economic partnerships. They're asking for nothing in return except permission to help. Similar reports poured in from dozens of worlds across Council space. Human ships were appearing wherever the economic collapse had created humanitarian crises, offering aid, expertise, and resources to desperate populations. They were not demanding anything in return, nor were they seeking to reestablish political relationships with the Council. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, who had led the human delegation during the fateful Council session a year earlier, appeared on the main communications screen to address the Assembly. She looked older than her years, bearing the weight of responsibility for the welfare of an entire species that had been forced to rebuild their civilization in exile. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice carrying a weariness that spoke of months of difficult decisions and hard work. "Humanity has not returned to seek readmission to your galactic community. We have built a new home beyond the rim, and we are content with our choice." Her words sent a chill through the Assembly. The humans were not coming back to rejoin galactic society. They were returning as outsiders, offering help to the very civilization that had rejected them. "However," Ambassador Vasquez continued, "we cannot stand by and watch innocent beings suffer because of political decisions they had no part in making. The colony worlds, the frontier settlements, the smaller species who depended on human services, they are not responsible for the Council's choices. We will not abandon them to the consequences of our departure." The humanitarian mission that the humans had undertaken was massive in scope and generous in spirit. They were using their advanced technology and organizational capabilities to provide aid to hundreds of worlds that were struggling with the aftermath of economic collapse. They were not seeking political advantage or economic benefit. They were simply helping because it was the right thing to do. "We offer this assistance freely, with no political conditions and no expectations of repayment," Ambassador Vasquez explained. "We ask only that you allow us to help those who need it most." The response from Council members was mixed. Some representatives were grateful for the humanitarian assistance, recognizing that their own governments lacked the resources to address the widespread suffering that had followed human departure. Others viewed the human aid mission with suspicion, wondering what ulterior motives might lie behind such apparent generosity. Councillor Thexmer voiced the skepticism that many felt. "What assurance do we have that this humanitarian aid isn't the first step in a human campaign to undermine Council authority?" Ambassador Vasquez's response was simple and direct. "You have no such assurance because we are offering you no political agreements or formal treaties. We are simply helping people who need help. Whether you choose to view that as threatening is entirely up to you." The stark contrast between human behavior and traditional galactic politics was impossible to ignore. Where Council members sought advantage, security guarantees, and formal agreements, the humans were offering unconditional aid to former associates who had treated them as a threat to be contained. As reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, the scope of human technological advancement became apparent. The ships that had appeared to offer humanitarian aid were clearly more advanced than anything humans had possessed during their time as Council members. Their industrial capabilities had grown dramatically during their year in exile, suggesting levels of innovation and productivity that exceeded anything in known galactic space. Dr. Yilnara of the Economic Research Institute received permission to analyze the human aid operations, and her findings were both encouraging and sobering. Human industrial capacity appears to have increased by several orders of magnitude since their departure, she reported. They're producing goods and services at rates that suggest they've solved fundamental problems in manufacturing efficiency that we haven't even recognized as problems. The humans had not just survived their forced exile. They had used it as an opportunity to rebuild their civilization according to their own principles, free from the constraints and compromises required by participation in galactic society. The result was a level of technological and social development that made their former Council colleagues appear primitive by comparison. Ambassador Zethkar found himself in the surreal position of watching his former political targets demonstrate the very qualities he had once considered dangerous. Their refusal to accept limitations, their innovative approaches to problem-solving, and their insistence on treating all beings with dignity and respect. "We stand at a crossroads," he addressed the Assembly, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "The humans have shown us what we lost when we forced them to leave. They have also shown us what we might have become if we had chosen cooperation over control." The choice facing the Council was both simple and profound. They could continue trying to rebuild their civilization using traditional approaches that had led to the current crisis. Or they could acknowledge that the humans had found better ways to organize society and seek to learn from their example. But the humans were no longer asking to join galactic society. They had built something better beyond the rim and had returned only to help those suffering from the consequences of their absence. The Council would have to decide whether to welcome that help with gratitude or view it with suspicion. In the end, the humans had forced the Council to confront a fundamental question. What kind of civilization did they want to build? One based on hierarchy, control, and the preservation of traditional privilege? Or one based on cooperation, innovation, and the belief that all beings deserved the opportunity to reach their full potential? The humans had made their choice and departed in silence. Now the Council would have to live with the consequences of their own decisions and decide what kind of future they wanted to create from the ruins of their shattered certainties.